We're talking about the precepts, and I understand that you've had some introduction to the 3 refuges and the 3 pure precepts, and brief introduction to the 10 great precepts. So tonight I'm going to talk about the 10 great precepts. Not all 10 of them. I've chosen out 3, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But the 10 great precepts are not to kill, not to steal, not to covet, not to lie, or not to say that which is not true, not to sell the wine of delusion, not to speak against others, not to be proud of oneself and devalue others, not to be mean in giving either dharma or wealth, not to be angry, and finally, not to defame the 3 treasures. So those are the 10 great precepts. The first 5 are common to just about every group of Buddhists that as I understand it, I could be wrong about that, I'm not a scholar, but many different schools of Buddhism take the first 5 of those precepts on killing, stealing. The third one they often translate as not indulging in sexuality or not misusing sexuality, and not to lie. And the 5th one they often translate or state as not to drink. And so we expand that a little bit into not selling the wine of delusion. So this morning at the monastery, we did our twice monthly renewal of vows ceremony, where we all recommit ourselves every 2 weeks to the precepts and the bodhisattva vow. And Reverend Master Mayon, our abbess, reads the precepts to us at this ceremony. And one phrase really leaped out at me this morning, which was that the precepts are called the pratimokshas, the practices that lead to liberation. And when the Buddha talked about liberation, what he meant was liberation from suffering. And so I love that about the precepts. They're the practices that lead to liberation. They're the practices that express liberation. So the Buddha taught that ignorance lies at the root of suffering. And sometimes he spoke of ignorance in terms of the 3 poisons: greed, hatred or anger, and delusion. And tonight I'd like to take a look at 3 of the 10 great precepts, which strike me as being specific antidotes for those 3 poisons. Now, all the precepts are antidotes for the 3 poisons. Don't get me wrong. All the precepts fill that role. These 3 are specific in a certain way that I'd just like to use them as an example of how they work. Reverend Master Jiyu taught us that, especially in the beginning in working on the precepts, was to pick one and train with it for a certain specific period of time. It could be a day or a week or whatever seems to be good for you. And to work with it, I find it helpful to state it to myself in the morning, to state my aspiration to keep this precept during the day, and then recall it throughout the day and kind of make maybe a mental note of what circumstances brought on this particular precept, or the urge to break it, or the impulse to break it, or the impulse to keep it. What circumstances were there around this particular precept? And then in the evening, you can reflect on it. And this is, I'm talking about 5 minutes reflection or something. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time. Reverend Master Jiyu taught us that starting with one precept, they open into each other. So, for example, if you start out with not speaking against others, that could open up into not being mean with giving, or not stealing because you're not stealing someone's good reputation, for example. And that they all open up into the 3 pure precepts, which are cease from evil, do only good, and do good for others. And Reverend Master Jiyu also pointed out an interesting thing, and that is that the one always harmed by breakage of the precepts is yourself, oneself. Certainly other beings and people and things can get harmed, and yourself always gets harmed. So that's an interesting motivator, not to harm yourself. I have a cat, and the cat likes to settle into a certain chair. And every time he settles into the chair, he curls himself up in such a way that he can take his 2 hind feet and pummel himself in the face. Well, that's what we're doing when we break the precepts. We're kind of pummeling ourselves. We're causing our own suffering. Okay, so the 3 precepts that I'd like to look at tonight in terms of greed, hatred, and delusion are not to covet, not to be angry, and not to sell the wine of delusion. I looked up the meanings of the words ignorance and delusion because sometimes they seem to be used a little bit interchangeably, and I think they mean something different, and they do indeed mean something different from each other. Ignorance is simply not knowing something. Delusion means that your mind or judgment is misled, and so that's a little bit different. In ignorance, you simply don't know. In delusion, you believe you know something, and you're wrong. I mean, so that's a little bit trickier, delusion. For example, I get the idea that a lot of people in the Middle Ages didn't know about astronomy, and so they were ignorant of astronomy, and that many of them thought that the Earth was at the center of the solar system. Well, they were deluded about the position of the Earth. So there's a little bit of subtle difference between being ignorant, just not knowing something, and being deluded, thinking you know something, and perhaps it's not correct. Looking into greed, hatred, and delusion, they all revolve around a fundamental misunderstanding of who we are. That is, relying on the notion of an ongoing separate self as the truth of our being. Greed is the self-centered mind of wanting or lacking. Anger is the self-centered mind of not wanting and wanting to get rid of. And delusion is the self-centered mind that sees the universe revolving around itself, this little me. I call my little self me sometimes in private to myself because it helps to lighten up, you know. Self-punishment or self-judgment isn't what the precepts are about. They're the practices that lead to liberation, and they're not something we want to beat ourselves up with. I don't know how many times Reverend Master Jiyu mentioned that, you know, they're not to be beaten up. We're not to beat ourselves up with them. And if you'll excuse me for a minute, there are some more folks waiting. I'll admit them. Okay, so we'll start with the third of the 10 great precepts, which is not to covet. The dictionary says that covet means to have an inordinate desire for something that belongs to another. So that precept deals with the first of the 3 poisons, greed. I think of coveting I sort of have an expanded definition for myself, not necessarily an inordinate desire for something that necessarily belongs to another, but just for something that doesn't belong to me, something that I don't have, that I don't have any reason to have, and that I want anyway. Kind of a chronic, nagging desire. So this is about greed, and I'm of an opinion that desire in itself is neither good nor evil. It's what we do with desire that can cause extraordinary suffering. Desire, for example, is what brought me here to Shasta Abbey. I met Reverend Master G.U., and I thought, she's got it. I want it. So what it was that I thought she's got was the truth or enlightenment. At the very least, she certainly knew how to meditate, and I wanted to learn how to do that. So in a way, it was a form of covetousness, wanting someone that someone else had. I desired something that she, quote, had, unquote. So desire, like I said, doesn't necessarily have to be all bad. It brought me here. And then it was what I did with it. You know, eventually I had to let go of that desire for what I thought she, quote, had, unquote. But it was a first step. It got me here. Like I mentioned before, sometimes this precept on coveting is stated as not to indulge in sexuality, and that's a strong generator of desire for many people. It's a survival impulse, and I'll say no more about that. I'm going to give a simple example of how coveting brings suffering, and I'm going to use the example of food. That's a lot safer to me than talking about sex. So, this is regard to food. I love food, especially sweets. As a new lay resident here, my ability to pick and choose what I was going to eat was suddenly and drastically limited. Sometimes a plate of cookies would be passed around among the community for a special occasion, like a tea after a ceremony. From the moment the cookies appeared, my mind would quiver with anxiety. Would I get a big cookie? Would I get one that was slightly burned around the outside edge, or a perfectly baked one? Would I even get a cookie at all? Because sometimes there weren't quite enough for everybody, and I was at the junior end of the line and last one to get a cookie. So my eyes would follow the plate of cookies from monk to monk, worrying whether each one would get the biggest cookie. When the plate finally got around to me, I'd scan it as quickly as I could, because I didn't want anyone to see that I was looking for a big one, and try to spot the biggest of the lot, which was tough because the cookies were basically the same size. There's where delusion enters in. I was thinking about this biggest of all cookies. They're basically the same size. Never mind, I knew that one of them was the biggest, and I wanted that one. Sometimes it would seem to me that a nearby Dharma brother or sister had gotten a bigger cookie than I got. And that's when coveting would arise. I wished I had that person's cookie. Now, along with this came a form of suffering that might be called dissatisfaction. And can you imagine how that affected my enjoyment of the wonderful cookie I did have? I probably didn't even taste any of those cookies during that period of time. I was probably so wound up with worry about who got the biggest and the most perfectly baked and the nicest and the one that had the most chocolate chips in it, you know. So anyway, it sounds ridiculous now, doesn't it? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but at the time, the suffering felt real. And when we get into areas that are more serious than cookies, such as sexuality, money, power, wealth, etc., this kind of attitude of mind can cause some pretty extraordinary suffering. So anyway, after some time, one of my Dharma sisters told me that her practice was always to take the cookie closest to her on the plate. Whoa, what a concept, I thought. I admired this monk, and I decided to emulate that practice of hers. It would, maybe save me some grief, and it did, sure enough. I finally came to enjoy, as a result of this practice of not coveting, refraining from coveting, I was able to enjoy the peace of mind, and consequential to letting go of the covetous desire for the biggest cookie, I was able to enjoy the cookie I had. And so, clearly, this tendency to covet required the notion of a, quote, me, who lacked something that someone else had or might get. The faulty notion of a separate self. As Reverend Master Jiyu says in her commentary to the Precepts, which is called the Kyoju Kaimon Commentary, there is nothing to be coveted and no one that covets. As it says in the morning service scripture, the scripture of great wisdom, everything is void, unstained, and pure. There is no doer, no deed, no object in true reality. But it's impossible to know this from the mind that covets. That's where meditation comes in, and our faith or confidence in the precepts. And these days, I'm happy to report that much of the enjoyment of a treat that we have in the monastery comes from sharing it amongst everybody in the room and all having it together. That's the greater enjoyment than the taste and the texture and the size of the treat. Okay, that's greed and covetousness. Going on to delusion. The precept is not to sell the wine of delusion. Okay. Delusion is subtle. I sometimes think of delusion as an unscrupulous lawyer. In the Buddhist teaching picture called The Wheel of Life, I wish I had one here and I don't, but I'm sure many of you or some of you are familiar with it. It's a picture of all the kinds of existence and suffering that there can be. And at the very center of it, keeping everything going, are a rooster, a snake, and a pig. The snake represents anger, the pig represents greed, and the rooster represents delusion. Now, why is that? I'm not sure. But my sister has a neighbor who keeps a rooster, and for years the neighbor kept this rooster. And the rooster would start crowing every morning around 10:30 or 11. And I can understand the rooster being identified with delusion. The rooster was selling the wine of delusion by telling us it was early morning, and it was really, 10:30 or 11. So, selling the wine of delusion. With growing wisdom, we learn the characteristics called the three characteristics: impermanence, non-self, and suffering. And we learn to see things as they truly are. Delusion clings to the opposite view, that things remain basically unchanging. Even though we can see them change, there's a subtle idea that things remain the same, and we get very upset when they don't. The notion that this me is the real thing, and that suffering can cease to exist if only. That's where the greed and anger come in. If only I had a different next door neighbor whose dog didn't bark at night, If only I had a better car or a better job or something, whatever is important. The precept asks us to undertake the training to refrain from selling the wine of delusion. And that phrase represents the sort of oldest formulation of the precepts, which goes, I will undertake the rule of training in order to train myself to refrain from killing or stealing or whatever the precept is. So this precept asks us to refrain from selling the wine of delusion. Reverend Master G.U. taught, if you delude other people with your theories and opinions, they will become drunk on those theories and will not be able to use their own minds to see what is really going on. And Reverend Master G.U. grew up in the time of Hitler, so she knew what she was talking about. We can delude ourselves. We do it all the time, very easily. Wishful thinking. I've seen the endings of at least 2 movies completely wrong from what the actual film showed, because I've seen what happened the way I wanted it to happen, and not what the actual film portrayed. And I've watched one of those movies 2 or 3 times, and I still haven't been able to see what happened at the end of that movie in the way everyone tells me it happened. So there's a very strong tendency to see things the way we think they should be or the way we think they are. If you want a very good example of selling the wine of delusion, you can look at political speech, and don't look at it too much, but political speech often contains examples of selling the wine of delusion. Something like, members of the Purple Party are against spitting on the floor, and they have scientific proof of its harm. Members of the Orange Party, however, promote floor spitting, and they cite evidence that it is healthy and enriching for all living things. This is silly, right? It's silly, but just read a political article sometime with care. It's very easy when one has strong opinions, strong views, and strong passions to dip into the wine of delusion. You know, I'm sure you're all adults, and many of you have had a sip of wine or 2 from time to time. I know I have. And you know the effect on the mind. It clouds the judgment. And that's how delusion works. Now, going on to the precept on anger, I will undertake the rule of training in order to train myself not to be angry. And I sometimes think of it as not to nourish anger, not to cultivate anger, not to feed anger, because anger arises. Reverend Master G.U.'s Kyoju Kaimon commentary says, there is that going on which causes us to see unclearly. But if we truly look, if we look with care, we'll see that the true and beautiful sky is shining behind the clouds. And I can still remember seeing this very thing on one of my early, if not my first airplane trip. Foggy and cloudy, and then the plane takes off and it climbs and climbs, and at a certain point, there you go above the clouds, and you see there's the beautiful blue sky and the sun shining above the clouds. So have you ever noticed how when the mind is inclined to anger, it will find something to be angry about, no matter what the circumstances? One of the monks calls this, another monk calls this, the heat-seeking missile. The anger is looking for something to latch onto. The other morning, I was feeling angry, and things began bothering me. Somebody needed this or that. Everybody needed something from me, something I couldn't give them, or something someone else couldn't do this or that I asked them to do. And all my well-made plans had to be reshuffled. There it is again, my plans. All my plans had to be reshuffled. That little me person trying to run the universe and being angry when it wasn't answerable to my personal will. So then the precept kicked in, because when we take the precepts and we really study them, they become part of our blood and bones, and they come in. They arise when the time is when they're needed. We say we take the precepts. I say they take us. At least they've taken me. So the precept kicked in, and I remembered that I will refrain from nourishing anger. First, there's the awareness of being angry. I had to realize that, oh, I'm angry here, and the wish to cease from that. But wait a minute, not so fast. Because by gum, that person did so and so, and they need to hear about it, right? Well, I have a right to be angry about it, don't I? Well, who's suffering from this? You know, the other person can suffer. If we go off on the other person and tell them what we think of what they did, they can suffer from that. But it's certain to be true that we will suffer even if we don't say anything or do anything. So awareness is a good start. Awareness of the fact that we're being angry and nourishing it. And it takes something else to turn away from the anger and towards right thought. It takes commitment to the precepts, it takes time, and it takes practice. That morning, after some time and work, I had to really work hard that day. I was sitting at breakfast and I was just thinking, oh, I'm really annoyed at such and such or so and so. And then, oh, wait a minute now. Just let that go. Just eat your breakfast. Just forget about it. Just let it go. Just let it pass away. And I had to do that many times. So don't be discouraged, because eventually it will pass. And that morning, after some time and much work, the angry clouds did dissolve, and the true and beautiful sky did indeed shine through.